So I hope everybody's having a good Monday today. So y'all know we are 1 week out from the Unit 2 deadline. And as is custom, I just want to clarify what that means. That means 1 week from today at 11:59 p.m., you need to have all 4 of your assignments checked off in order to be good to go for liftoff. And so that doesn't mean all 4 turned in. It means all 4 have been demoed and you're good to go on all 4. If you have any issues scheduling a demo at all, please let me know between now and 9 p.m. on that Monday next week. And so we can get you scheduled with a TA and make sure that's taken care of. And yeah, if you have any other questions about that, please let me know. We're winding things down. We only have 2 proper classes left, and it's just it's amazing. Definitely take a minute to reflect on when you came in, not knowing what a function was or a loop was or variable was for a lot of us, and now you're setting up APIs and learning about building a full stack application. So yeah, a lot can be done in a short period of time. I know for me, it felt like there's still so much that I didn't know, which is certainly true of everybody, but it is it's very cool to see how much you can go in a short period of time with technology. And so definitely hoping the best for everybody in the next week to get your stuff together, and let me know if you have any issues.
Thanks, Colin. All right. I'm going to resume sharing here. All right. So tonight we are talking about authentication. We're going to talk about that. You will have a studio tonight. You got kind of a break the last 2 classes without having a regular studio. You're able to just kind of work on an assignment, but tonight is they actually have an exercise for you. We'll talk more about that at the end. So yeah, Monday is that deadline, and but keep in mind that's a catch-up class too. You will have access to TAs for 3 hours that entire class, and but be kind to your TAs and try to get your stuff in as early as possible so they have time to really have a more open schedule to schedule demos with, and can have time to really grade it and get it in well in time. But they will be available that night to help you with any last minute hiccups you might have. All right, so authentication. This is about verifying a user's identity. So we're going to talk about this concept of authentication. We'll talk about what sessions and cookies are, the flow of authentication on a website throughout your application. And we'll talk about password hashing, the user as an object. We'll talk about what DTOs are, data transfer objects, and then we're going to look at what it's like to actually do registration and login setup with models and controllers, and then how to filter those requests so that users will only see the pages that you want them to see, depending on whether they're logged in or not. All right, so what is authentication? This is just verifying users' identity. So you want your website to be available to the general public. Some pages are available to the general public, some pages are not. If that's the case, then you need to implement authentication, and you'll use some sort of way to verify their ID, like a username password combo is the most common. And this will give you ability to control what they will see. So it looks a little bit like this. You've got your view, in an MVC application, this is what it looks like. You got your view, you got your controller, you got your model, all of the different requests, and the way that the code is providing the information through this model. But then when the user interacts, you can actually essentially have a filter in place that controls what they can see, depending on whether they're logged in or not. And authentication is key to that. So the first question that a lot of people ask is, what's the difference between authentication and authorization? We hear the term auth, like, but which one does that stand for? And okay, so authentication asks the question, do we even know who you are? And then authorization says, what role or permissions do you have as a known user? Like, we know who you are, but we need to make sure that you've got permissions to do this, this, or this. So we're really mostly focusing on authentication because we just want to implement something that allows people to log in and we can verify that they are who they say they are. But once you have that, you can certainly have authorization in place in order to give them, different controls, different roles. We're not going to talk about how to actually implement different types of roles tonight. We're just pretty much going to stick to, you're either logged in or you're not. But that could be a next level that you might, implement on an application that you're building. Okay, so there's actually something that comes with Spring built in. There's additional dependencies, I should say, that are part of Spring called Spring Security. And it's amazing and does really, really cool stuff. Makes it easy to implement it once you understand how it works. For both authentication and authorization. But we are not going to teach you Spring Security. There's no time for that. We are spending exactly one class on this. So what you're really going to do is we're just going to teach you basic authentication. And that actually means that while Spring Security can do a bunch of things for you very, very easily, and you kind of at the press of a button, there's very little you'd have to do to implement it. We're going to break that down a little bit and so you can see under the hood, and we're going to do a few things with basic authentication that Spring Security would normally do for you. But we want you to see, what's actually going on and what's the magic, the man behind the curtain, what are they doing? So we'll just focus on that and just the basic steps for authentication without actually fully implementing Spring Security. Your capstone project would be a great time to learn Spring Security if you're interested. My group, when we did our project when I was a student, one guy on our team really dug into it and figured it out. And it was pretty neat to be able to implement that. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture. Now let's talk about sessions and cookies. If you want to track user info in the browser, you need sessions and cookies. So this is something that you have heard of, but you may not understand what it actually means. Let's talk about it. A session is something that gets created on the back end when a user signs in successfully. And it says, okay, you've signed in, we've started a session. And then that will have the knowledge of the user from the database. But the only thing that the browser knows about is the session ID. And then cookies are actually a key value pair that's stored in the browser. It can store lots of different information, but the very first cookie that has to exist is the session ID with that value. Once that exists, additional cookies can be added for that user. So you could track other information like, things that they've put in their shopping cart or, pages that they visited and pages that they haven't. There's lots of things that you could be tracking about them. But that session ID continues to be passed back and forth with the HTTP requests that are being made to the server, and that maintains that session and it keeps things updated. So that's kind of the concept there with sessions and cookies. So to understand how this gets actually accomplished, you need to understand the flow of everything. So there's multiple paths that can be taken. What if there was no cookie, but a session ID, there is no cookie with a session ID. It doesn't exist. So that person either needs to register, or maybe that cookie was deleted, or it's a different device or a different browser, in which case you're going to automatically send them to log in. If you have a cookie and it exists with a session ID, then you can feel fairly certain you've got an existing user. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're logged in at the moment, but you may still have that cookie for them. So the session ID, if it's still valid, the page content will load. If it's expired, then you're just going to send them to log in so that they need to log in again. From the login page, let's say that someone is trying to log in and authentication fails. Then you would want to send them back to the login page. If it succeeds, on the other hand, you'd want to load whatever content you want them to see at that point. And if they log out, that session ends and the ID is invalidated and they get sent back to the login page or maybe to some other page that you want them to go to at that point. So lots of different flows here. So that you have the person, they're visiting your site. The browser looks to see if there's cookies, and you can have this, if there is a stored session ID, then it's going to check in the back end, reach out to the server and say, is that a valid or invalid session? If it's valid and they're still logged in, they can see whatever private pages they have permissions to see. Otherwise, if it's invalid, it's just going to send them back to register or log in. If you have the cookies, but there's no stored session ID, then, go to register or log in. If they do register or try to log in, that's where it hits that authentication process. And you're, making sure that they are who they say they are, that you've got knowledge of them. If they fail, you just send them back. If they succeed, then, the session gets created. The ID is sent to the browser. The cookie is set. That key value pair gets set with the session ID. And now they have permissions to go to the page. Okay. So there's, lots of different possible things. And this looks complex, but by the end of the night, you're going to see that there's just a number of things we can put in place to handle all of it. And it'll take care of it for us once we have all the things in place. I did not put a questions slide right after this, but I feel like I should stop and just see if anybody's got any questions about any of this before I keep talking. Anybody got questions? No? Okay. Let's talk about password hashing. So there is this concept of password hashing. This means you're encrypting a password for storage because you never, ever, ever, ever store a password as is on a database. So we want to use a cryptographic hash function. And that way, every time the user logs in, we take their password and it's encrypted. We check that hash against the hash that was stored in the database. And those should match. As long as those match, you're good. And typically, currently, the recommended function to use is bcrypt. This is a dependency that can be added. I actually have it added in my art gallery project. Right here in the build.gradle file, you can see that I've got right here on line 20. This actually is part of the Spring security package, but it's the only little piece that we're really using is the encryption stuff. So that will allow you to access that bcrypt. And then there's some things that we're going to do in the model to actually handle that. We're going to create a user model and actually have a way to handle hashing that password. But that's the idea. It creates a super, super long string of characters that is extremely difficult, like could take years with current computing abilities to decrypt, depending on the algorithm. And bcrypt is generally regarded right now as the one that is the least likely to become obsolete anytime soon, even though computing power is increasing all the time. And of course, people always talk about quantum computing and the changes that could potentially bring for security issues. And but this is the best one to use for now. It should be good to go for a while because it provides for some pretty deep encryption that's very difficult to reverse engineer. Okay. So if you want to hash your passwords, typically you want to, I just said this. Okay, yeah. I had more bullet points, guys, but it looks like I just said all of this. Yes, I did. Okay, so there you go. Shouldn't be obsolete anytime soon. So we are going to do some coding. I promise we're going to do lots and lots of coding, but I need to talk about all of this first because I want to talk about everything conceptually. And then we're going to see what, the actual syntax and the files and things that we're going to need to add to update our project. We're going to start with the user. This is the first thing we're going to do. We are going to set up a user model as an entity so that it can be persistent in the database. And so we'll set up a user class. It's going to be set up just like any other entity we've set up in terms of having, certain annotations and, having a username and a password hash field. Those are the things that you want to be stored in your table. And really the only getter you need is for username, because you're going to have it's going to actually always go check that hash for you. And so you'll use the static variable called encoder that's actually going to create an object from that bcrypt encoder dependency we talked about. And that will allow you to access some methods that you then can use to encrypt it and then also to check and see if it matches. So your constructor will receive a like regular plain text password, but then you're not going to store that. You're going to, encrypt it and then store it in that, password hash field instead. So we'll have this an instance method to actually check and see if they match. And that's where we're going to, at any time they attempt to log in, we'll run this from our controller and compare it to the hash in the database. And there are some methods that we're going to use. You can use this method in code for encoding it in the first place, but you don't want to re-encode it to check it and use equals like a string comparison. You want to actually use encode.matches. It's a very specific method that's part of bcrypt that will go and check those hashes for you. So we're going to do that part first. Before we actually create this, let me orient you a little bit to some of the things that I have added here. I'm going to close this and we're going to take a look at, let's see. So I've gone ahead and added a couple templates that we're going to be using. We've got a login page here that just has a username and a password field for them to log in, has a little link. Don't have an account? Register here, and we'll send them over to the register page. Register page looks like this. It has a username. It also has password and verify password, and then the button to register. And these are all going to make use of some things that we have not created yet, but I wanted you to know that they're already here. Okay, so we'll have those. We'll use them when we need them, but we have quite a few files we're going to need to add. We're going to start with the models. We're just going to create a user model and we'll go from there. So let's create a class called user. We're going to give it the entity annotation. We want it, let's see, let me double check we do want to extend abstract entity because we need it to have an ID, right? Every user needs to have an ID in the database. So that will go ahead and take care of creating that ID for the table for us, just like all of the other things that we have. So let's do, we're going to have a username. We want it to be not null. We're going to go ahead and put that validation on there. And we'll just say private string username. And then we're going to do the same thing for the password hash. Private string password hash. Okay. And we'll have an empty constructor so that we can pass that down to the form, just like we've done with other things in the past, so that already has knowledge of what the structure is for the object. And then we'll have the actual constructor that's used for instantiating an object. And that's going to, and really, I mean, I could go ahead and just use this, right, to go ahead and do this, but we're going to need to modify it because what we really want here is to pass in a password. And then here, we're going to set the password hash with by calling out a function that we haven't created yet. So we're gonna have to come back to this, and it's got a little red squiggly line, so it's reminding us. But we can do a getter for the username. And then this is where we want to have this method that's going to encrypt, and then we can come up here and we can add a call to that method here. So we're going to create private, and this is definitely private, static, and final. It needs to not be able to be overwritten, and it needs to be private to this particular file. And you can see already as I'm typing in bcrypt password, it already knows about this because it's part of that dependency, and I already have that into, in the build. So bcrypt password encoder, I'm going to call it encoder, and I'm just going to say I want a new instance of a bcrypt password encoder, and I can just create it like this, and now we have access to this, and we can come up here and say, okay, when we receive a string password from the form that to create this object, we're going to take that and encrypt it here. We'll call encoder.encode, and then give it the password and set that value for the password hash, and that'll be the hash that's stored in the database. So then the last thing to do is to create the instance method that's actually for matching later. If they go to log in, we need to be able to check that hash. And that's where I was talking about how we're not going to use encodes again. We're going to use a different method called matches. So we'll say public Boolean is matching password, and it'll just receive the password that they try to use when they go to log in. And so we'll say return, and this is going to be a Boolean value. We just established that encoder.matches, and we give it first the string that they tried to log in with, and then the second argument is the actual hash that is stored with the object in the database. So it's going to go ahead and handle that comparison for us. It's all built in as part of this object from bcrypt. So a little bit of specialty work, but otherwise it just looks like a normal Java class and a normal entity, right? Everything else is pretty familiar. Okay, so we have ourselves an entity. We're in good shape there. Okay, so the next step is to have a repository for this persistence for the database, right? So it'll be set up just like any other repository, but we do want one custom method that we can use the naming rules of CRUD repository. You may remember this about CRUD repository. It's pretty cool because it allows you to create your own methods just by using some conventions with naming rules. And so we can actually call it find by username and have it take the parameter username, and it knows exactly what it needs to do. So that's all we really need to do. So we're going to come up to our, come back over here. We're going to come up to our data here, and we're going to create a new interface called user repository. Okay. And just like with the other ones, we just need to add that repository annotation. And then we need to extend CRUD repository. And we need to specify here that we want the user object to be the object that it is working with. And then of course the ID is going to be an integer. And let me, yeah, there we go. Yeah. But while ordinarily you just leave the body blank because you're just counting on using built-in methods, this is where we're going to have our custom one. So we're just going to say we want to return a user and we want to find them by username. And then we just say this should take a username so that you can go look it up. And then it looks at the user model and says, oh, hey, you have a field called username. I know exactly what to do. And that's all we have to do. We just have to use those naming rules that CRUD repository wonderfully provides for. And then we don't actually have to write the definition. We can just declare it and it'll take care of it for us. All right, so we've got that part done. And we're not going to need a controller for a user specifically, because what we're not trying to control anything about the user themselves. What we're trying to control is the authentication process, the process of them logging in or logging out or registering. So we're going to have something called an authentication controller instead. All right. We're going to get to that in a minute though, because the first thing we need to talk about are DTOs. These are data transfer objects. This is a special type of Java class that just bundles data together. It says, we know you have a couple different types of data that you would like to be able to correlate. So let's create a little class that its only job is just to encapsulate all that together. And then you can send and receive it. It's very useful for forms, because maybe you have multiple unrelated entities, otherwise unrelated, or you have fields that don't really directly correspond to an entity that is persistent with a specific table. These are different circumstances in which it's helpful to use a DTO, because you can just, it's a means to an end, right? It gives you a way to define, create an object that, correlates that data together, bundles it together, and then you can send and receive it throughout your application as needed. So this is a great solution for authentication. You're not saving that password in the database, but you need the password to be sent along with the username. So here's the naming convention. Typically a DTO is going to, if you're bundling two classes together, you want to name it class 1, class 2 DTO. That's going to be the name of it. If you have some sort of form that maybe it's named after, you could just give it the name of the form, some form DTO. Maybe you just have input fields that don't correspond to a specific entity. Those would be examples of the naming conventions that you might use in situations like this. You typically want to declare your fields as private. You want to make sure they have validation if they're part of a form. And then you can just have an implicit default constructor. You don't have to have anything special. You do want to have getters and setters so that Spring can automatically use those and allow you to use dot notation in your templates without having to call the getters and setters directly, but you have to have them in the DTO in order for it to use them. And you don't want to add that entity annotation, because remember, this is not an entity. It does not correspond to a table in your database. It's just a way to bundle together some data as an object of a class, of a Java class. So now that you know what a DTO is, let's talk about specifically what that might look like for registration and login. So we're going to have a lot of things to set up here, but we're going to do it a step at a time. When you want to create these for login and registration forms, you can use these to carry the username and password back and forth. And so we're not actually ever creating objects of the user class directly. Instead, the form will have the same two fields. Registration forms and login form will have the same two fields, except registration also has that verify password field, as I showed you in the template. So that we can, do a little bit of extra validation to make sure they got it right before they submit it. And so we're going to just essentially take advantage of inheritance, right? If we have one thing that is almost identical to the other, we might as well create one and then let the other one inherit from it, and then only add on what's different. So we'll start with the login and then actually let registration inherit the username and password from that, and then only add on the verification. Again, we're not using the entity annotation because these are not meant to be persistent. They're just for carrying around data while the application is doing its thing. So you do want to add validation, any messages that you want to be on the page for the user to let them know if there's something they're not doing quite right. They don't have, the right number of characters or types of characters, or they left something blank accidentally or whatever. So let's go over and take a look at what this is going to be like. We are going to go into our models folder here, and I'm going to right click and create a new package called DTO. And then inside of that, I'm going to create a class called login form. So this is an example where I'm using this specifically for putting together information that belongs to a form. So I'm going to name it after that form. Login form DTO is what I'm going to call it. And this is it. So again, no entity annotation. This is not an entity. But we do want to have quite a lot of, I'm going to create the fields first, but we're going to want quite a lot of validation stuff on here. So first we'll just say, you know, we want a username. We want a password. We want both of these to be not null. And so the message there could be, you know, username is required. And we could also put not blank on here. Except for apparently I did not. There we go. And we could use the same message in this instance. But we're also going to use size so that we can specify how long it needs to be. I'm going to say it has to be a minimum of 3, a max of 30, and if they don't meet that requirement, I will give them a nice specific message to let them know what to do differently. Okay. So I'm going to do essentially the same thing. I'm just going to copy this for password, except in the case of password, 3 is definitely too small, right? And really these days 6 is too small too, but I'm going to go with 6. Most people are going to require like at least 8 these days. So then I just need to update this to have the right message. So I'll just say 6 to 30 characters long, and we'll have that. And then we add our getters and setters for both of these. Okay, and that's pretty much it. The main purpose of this is just for us to be able to facilitate the form and combine these two things together, since we aren't actually storing a password, unhashed password with the user. Gabe, you got a question?
Yeah, I was just curious if, like, do you need not null if you're also using not blank?
Say that again.
If you're using not blank, do you also need not null? Doesn't not blank already cover the whole case?
There's a I am blanking, so to speak, on the distinction between the two. I actually found an article about it a while back, and I know I had pasted it in Slack, but it may have be gone by now. But yeah, you could Google that, the difference between the two, because there is a distinction, and it has to do with the way that it is read from the form by the browser. And because not null would mean that it doesn't, like, not blank means it could have substance to it. It could be blanks, like somebody may have hit the space key a couple times. So it actually has a length. It's not null, but it is still blank. I think that might be the distinction. It's something like that. So you're just covering all your bases by having both. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay, so we've done this, we have this, and now we need all of this for registration, right? So we can go and create the registration one, inherit from this, and only add the third one that we need. So I'm going to create a new one, registration form DTO. And I'm going to say extends login form DTO. All right. So really the only thing that we need for the registration form DTO is to have that additional verify password field. So I'm just going to borrow from this here and put this in here and just call it verify password, and give it the exact same information though for, you know, the password field. They have the same requirements, right? And we'll just say, you know, actually this is straightforward. I can just add getters and setters. Boom. Okay. And that's all I really need to do for this. for now. So this will give us the ability to have the data that we need bundled together when we need it, just to facilitate the work that's done between the controller and the browser and everything. All right. So that's our registration and login DTOs. This is going to be one of those times where we have to do a lot of coding and get a lot of things in place before we can actually run this thing and see how it works, right? So you just have to bear with me and we'll get it up and running in a little bit. Okay. So now let's talk about the controller. This is where a lot of the work is done, right? You have to have a lot of logic, and we're gonna tap into some of these things to handle all of these processes: login, registration, log out. So we'll declare a user repository instance with AutoWired, just like we have done for other things in the past in other controllers. And that'll allow us to tap into the database. So first we're going to create a new class here, and we'll call it user control. No. We're not calling it user controller. We're calling it authentication controller. There we go. Okay. Okay. So we have, we have the beginnings here, and we want to, auto wire in the user repository. So get back to here. There we go. All right. So we'll say auto wired and have a private user repository. All right. That'll give us access to our database for the user. And then there's going to be some other things we need to add here. We need a variable called user session key. This is going to be that key we talked about that's important to establish that the user has created a session. So static and final, which you may recall, makes it a constant. So we'll have private, static, final, string, user session key. And we're just going to call it user. The key itself is just going to be user. And then we'll have this instance method that allows us to go and find the user object that is correlated with whatever that session is. Justin, you got a question?
I do. The DTOs, how do those compare to things like view models in C#?
I do not know C#.
Okay. This looks very similar, but I couldn't really tell. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's very possible. That would be a good thing to Google because yeah, if you're familiar with one, it might help you in your understanding of the other. Unfortunately, I have studied a lot of things, but C# is not one of them. So I'm afraid I can't help you with that. You could ask that question in Slack too. It's very likely that some of the TAs have done the C# course with Launch Code and may be able to answer that. Okay, so this instance method is going to allow us to provide this information and go look up that object in the database. So this is where we had that custom method that we wrote for the repository to be able to look them up by username, right? But this is going to actually let's see, we're going to create a session. There's oh, I think I have these in a different order in my thing. I do. Okay. So let me move down here. Here we go. Okay. So, but this is actually going to let us start with the session key and go in and get it. I think that I want to keep talking about this before I code this because I'd like to code these in the opposite order. So essentially what we're going to be working with, this is why, we're going to be working with this class called HTTP session that allows us to create these sessions, IDs, and cookies very easily. It's something that's just built in. And it creates a whole object, a session object. And one of the things that it stores is that ID. And so then we're also going to have a method called set user in session. That's going to be when we actually create the session, this is how we create it. And when they first register or when they successfully log in, when they come back. Set user in session is how that's going to happen. And then we can always go and look them up, get the user information from that session. So these kind of go hand in hand. So let's go over and do both of these. And I'm going to start with the second one. I'm going to start with set user in session. So what this one does is it actually stores the key value pair with that session key and the user ID. So we'll say private static void set user in session. And then we're going to use this HTTP session to create a session object. And then we're also going to be making use of our user, which, there we go. All right, gotta make sure we get all those imports in there. Okay, so we have a session now that's being created as part of this process. We're going to make use of it. We're going to say session dot set attribute. This is where we can say, I want to create a key value pair. And so the key needs to be the user session key that we created, which is just the string user, but that's what we want to use. The value is actually going to be the user's ID. So we're going to use the getter for the ID from the abstract entity, right? To go get that user's ID, and that will be what gets set as the session key there. This is the user, this is their ID. We're going to store that information together. And then the second thing here, well, that is all you need to do. I actually had, I think I had, I just have a log to the console. But we're not going to be running this right away, so we're not going to worry about it. Okay, so that will actually create the session. Now, what happens if we need to go actually look things up? We're going to have another method, but this one's going to be public. It's going to return the user. This is where we actually say, okay, we've got this session, but we need to go look up the user. So get user from session. Again, we're going to use a session provided by HTTP session that will bundle all that information together. And if the user ID is null, oh, I skipped a line. Okay. Yeah, we need a user ID. You'll notice that I'm typing this with the capital I integer. That's because we need to cast this to that for it to be used here. It requires it to be in the wrapper class, integer instead of int. So we're going to say session.get attribute, and we're going to say, please go get me the user associated with this session key. And that's that same session key that we established up here, right? So go get that user ID and return it as capital I integer. So this will take care of that for us. And then here we can actually go check it and say if it's null, and I think, yep, there we go. I've been coding in JavaScript for my other class, so I'm all about the triple equals right now. Okay, double equals null, then we'll just return null. And so that way we can say, yep, that user ID, we did not find a user ID associated with that user session key. And then we can just return null. And then otherwise, this is where we have to delve into optionals again, okay? So remember that optional is just a way for you to transfer information about the potential information that you're actually looking for without actually getting nothing back. You can get a response back. Good heavens. So I'm going to say optional, and I don't know why. I see what I did. I must have undone something. All right. Sorry, guys. Return null. Return null. And then after that, okay, optional. Here we go. This is going to be an optional container that is going to potentially hold a user object. The problem is we don't know if we're going to get a user back or not. So we have to use an optional to say, maybe we'll get a user back, maybe we won't. And so I'm going to call this user opt. and then just say user repository, find by ID, and then I'm going to give it that user ID that I just found here. Because remember, if it's not null, it's just going to skip past this, right? So we know we have a user ID at this point. That's one of the reasons that we need to actually preemptively do that early return here, is if we don't have it, we can't move on here anyway. So we'll just return null. But if we do have it, we can actually go to the user repository, say, find this user by ID, and have it go to the database and look it up. And if it can find a user associated with this ID, then it can return it. And so this is where we're going to then check and say, okay, now, does the database have what we're looking for? And we'll say if user opt is empty. So if it came back and it actually doesn't have anything, the container is empty, then we want to return null again, because we, in fact, do not have a user for that ID. But let's say the user ID is valid and the user comes back from the database, then we're good to go. We can return that user object. We just need to unbox it. So we're going to say user opt get, and that'll actually take it out of the optional and say, ta-da, here's your user object. We found it. Okay. So that is the process there of just making sure that you're not working with, data that doesn't exist, and actually getting the user out once you verify that it is in the database. And then you'll have a user to work with, or you won't. It'll either have the user or it'll be null. Okay. So that is everything that you need to do just to handle that whole process of facilitating. Do we actually have a session? Do we actually have a user? Are they in the system? So now it's just about the traffic cop side of a controller, where we're going to have handlers for our different routes, right? And we have 3. We have register, login, and log out that we're going to need to manage. Normally I'd be taking a break right about now, but we still have a ways to go, so our break's going to be a little bit late. We're going to have to keep going for now. That's okay. This is a lot to do, but I want to walk you through it just a little bit at a time. Okay, so for the get handlers, just to be able to display the pages the way that we want them, for login and register, we're just going to use model.attribute to pass down instances of that form DTO class in each instance that we created, because again, we want the form to already have knowledge of those objects that it can create from those classes. And then we'll just return the path of whichever template we want, the login form or the register form. So we'll do that for each of those. And on the template side, we're going to use data binding like we've done in the past, where we just use th field and th errors and have it handle, everything about those fields. And that'll take care of that. And then for the post handlers, we're going to do several things that are going to be the same for both login and register. So let's talk about those first. First of all, if there are any errors from validation, we want to send them back to the form that they were on, right? But then we're also going to look and see if there's an existing user with that username, whether they're logging in or registering, either way. And we want to reject value for custom error messages with custom error messages if we have anything else we'd like to check for. So those are 3 things that we can do for both of these. They might just look slightly different for each one. But then there's some things we're going to want to do differently depending on whether it's registration or login, because they do have slightly different functionality, right? For registration, we want to send an error message back if that user already exists. You're trying to register a user that is already in the system. What if password and verified password don't match? We need to handle that. But if those 2 things are cool, then we can create a new user. We can save that user to the database, and then we can put them in session. We can call that method we wrote to make sure that the session is started up. For login, we want to send an error message back if the user doesn't exist at all, or if the password was wrong. So there's kind of different criteria, right? Which makes sense. And then if everything's cool, we set the user in session and create a new session. No matter what their session used to be, if they're logging in, we're going to create a new one. Okay, So let's go take care of the registration and login portions of this, and then we'll come back and talk about logout, and then we'll take a break. All right, so down here below these session methods we wrote, we are going to put our handlers. Okay, so for registration, let's do the get mapping for register. And we're just going to have public string. I'm going to say, display registration form. And we need our model class here so that we can pass some data down. And then we also are going to need this HTTP session to have access to that object. So we'll pass down. Oh yes, we said we needed to pass down an instance of the registration form DTO. Here we go. Just so it knows what that object is going to look like. And that's where we're using that empty constructor for that. And then we also are going to pass down we're going to pass down a Boolean because ultimately we're going to need to be able to tell whether someone's logged in or logged out to decide what we're going to show them on the page, right? So I'm actually going to hold off on this. I want to wait. I'm going to put a to-do here instead because I want to save that for last. So I'm going to, I need a comment. Comment, to-do. Okay. Send value of logged in Boolean. Okay, so we'll need to pass that down later. But right now we're just going to return register, which as you recall is just the template that is stored right inside the template folders. I have that register template, it's right there. So I can just return register. Okay, so that takes care of the get mapping for register. What about the post mapping? We want to be able to handle when they submit the form. So we will have the same exact route, but this time it'll be for posting. And this one is where things get a little bit more involved. We have, we said we had multiple error handling to do, right, before we actually set the user in a session. And, save them as a new user. So we're going to start with just the regular string process registration form. Kind of give this a typical name. And then we're going to use the model attribute annotation so that we can handle that DTO object that's created from that DTO class. And we're also going to add @valid so that we can have it handle the validation that we provided for. And so we're just going to say, I want an object to be formed from that DTO that has that username, password, and verify password. And so after that, we need to access the errors object. And then here's something that is new. We want HTTP servlet request. And I think I failed to. Yeah, there we go. That's going to give us access to something about the requests that we need. And we'll get into that in just a second when we get to it. Okay, so several things to do here. Send user back back to the form if errors are found, right? We said we needed to do that. We also said that if there are no errors and we're not sending them back, then we're going to save the new username and password. And of course, it'll be hashed. We'll start a new session. And then we're going to redirect them to the home page once they've logged in. Okay. So a couple different sections here, and there's multiple errors we're checking for. The first one is what if that errors object has errors, right? So we can just check for that right off the bat and say if errors has errors. just like we have done in the past for other forms that we have been handling. Then we're just going to say return register. We're just going to send them right back. But otherwise we can actually go say, okay, let's go see if we have an existing user, and go to the user repository, find by username. This is where we actually say, okay, they gave us a username. Let's use it and see if we can find them. So we're going to say, go to the registration form DTO object and get username. So that's just the object that actually represents, that data in the DTO. So get the username from this object that you created with the data from the form that's coming in as, query params, and then go look up the username from the database. And if you get something back, that's our existing user. So if we actually have an existing user, if an existing user is not null, then we need to create a new error that doesn't actually exist yet in the errors object, because it's not something that's actually handled with any of those annotations. We're going to create one on the fly. We're going to say, for the username field, create an error. We're just going to call it username.alreadyExists. This does not matter because we're not referencing anything outside this file. But we just need to fill the space for this parameter. We just need an argument. So I'm just going to call it username.alreadyExists. And then I'm going to say a user with that username already exists. That's my message. Okay, that's the default message for that field. And so that way it'll put it exactly the same place it puts any other messages that it gets through validation. But we're adding this to the potential errors that could be, placed, and we're saying reject it on this basis. This is what we want you to reject it on, and here's the message to provide to the user. And then we can send them from here. Yeah, and then we can return register. Just like we did above, we still want to send them back to the form. It's just that we also want to activate this error. Okay, so that was the second reason, is that they might not exist. The third one is, what if the passwords don't match? So we need to first create just a quick string here and say, go to that object that you created, get the password, and then for verify password, we're going to also go to the object and say get verify password. Okay, so I'm just doing this so that the next couple of lines here are not crazy. All right, so if not password equals verify password. And this is, remember, all we're doing here is comparing the literal plain text that they provided from the form. We have just intercepted, we've just received exactly what they typed into the form at this point when they submitted the form. And we're just comparing their two strings to see if they match. This has nothing to do with hashing because we're not even at that point yet. We just want to make sure that they didn't have two different strings. So then we're going to use that errors reject value again. And this time we're going to say, we want to put it on the password field. I'm just going to call it passwords.mismatch or something. And then I'm just going to say passwords do not match and just leave it there. And then we'll return them back to the form. So 3 different instances in which we would need to send them back to the page depending on what the problem is. But if none of those things are a problem, then we can do what they were trying to do, and we can create the user. We'll say user, new user equals a new user. How about that? And then we can pass in from the registration form DTO, we can say, okay, go get that username and then go get that password. And we've used the DTO up until this point just to keep track, combine that information together for us that came in from the form. And now we're ready to actually use the user object to create an actual user. And this is where we're going to pass the password in, but then it's going to immediately encrypt it as part of the user object. So we'll have created the user. And now we can go to the user repository and say, okay, we've got a user object. We want to put it in the database. So let's save the new user in the database. And then we want to set up a session, right? Because now that they've registered, we want to treat them as, we don't want to make them log in. Now, I don't know if you've ever been on a website where that's happened to you. You register and then they make you log in and it's like, but I just, right? So this will like just start the session. And so we'll say, this is where we access the request. We need to actually go to the request and get the session that's stored as part of that HTTP request. And then we'll give the new user object so that they can access the ID. And then we will return a redirect. And this is going to send it, in this case, I'm saying I want to send it to the artworks page. I actually don't want to go to the home page. I want to go to the artworks page. So I'm going to have it look for the controller and the handler associated with this path, which as we know is actually over here in the artwork repository, right? Sorry, not repository, controller. I didn't go far enough up. This is where /artworks lives. And so it's actually going to now run this one so that we can display everything on that page. All right, let me get back to where I was. Authentication controller, here we go. Okay, yeah. So it's going to redirect and it's going to go run that handler now so that it can do what it needs to do. Okay, that is the registration controller process. You know, lots of different stuff going on here, but it's a logical progression of checking for this type of error, this type of error, this type of error. If none of those are true, then we finally go and we create the user, we save them in the database, we set them in a session, and then we send them to the page we want them to go to at that point. Okay, so that's registration. Let's do the same thing for login. It's going to be similar. We're going to do git mapping. How are we doing on time? We got about half an hour. Okay. This is going to be for the login route. And we're going to have display login form, model, HTTP session. There we go, session. Okay, it's going to look really similar to the registration, but this time we're going to pass it down. My bad. Yeah. So something that you can do that I have never mentioned before, but you can actually just do the login form DTO like this, and it's actually implicit, like Spring knows to just create a variable for use called login form DTO. So I can actually just do this and it automatically knows that login form DTO is the corresponding variable for that. Okay. And then later we're going to add, how did I word it before? Oh yeah, send value of logged in, Boolean. Okay. We'll do that in a bit. For now, we're just going to return login so that it will actually send it to the login template that is right down here in the templates folder. Okay, that's it. Pretty straightforward. But again, post mapping is where it gets more interesting because we have more things that we have to consider about how to process all the information that we've been sent when they submit the form. So process login form. And we'll use model attribute so we can let it create this object of the login form DTO class for us. We're going to enable validation. Okay. And then we will allow for our errors object. There we go. And then again, the HTTP servlet request will give us access to the request. Okay. So similar to the first one, the first thing to do is just say if there's errors, then return login. We're going to send them right back. But let's go look up the user, right? I'm going to call it the user. So we're going to say, we're looking up the user. We're going to go to the repository, find by username. This is going to be the username they just gave us, which will be stored in this login form DTO object that came in from the form. So we'll just use that, go to the database immediately and say, hey, does this exist? And then here, we're going to have a string to just store that password that they provided in the form when they submitted it. It's just a regular string. And then with those two things, we can check to see if the password that they gave us, once it's hashed, matches the password that's in the database for this user that we have looked up. So two things to check for. If the user is null, because maybe we went to get the user and there was in fact not a user, or if not the user, and this is where we're going to go directly to the class or to the, well, it's an instance method, but we're going to the user object and we're going to that method that we created is matching password. And we're going to call it and say, here's the string to check. And it's going to use that encoder.matches method to see if this password once hashed matches what's in the database. And if as long as that's if that's a problem, if it does in fact not match, then this is where we throw this error. Reject value. And I'm actually going to do this on multiple lines because there's a lot going on here. I'm going to say for the password field, we'll just call it login invalid. And here's something we're going to do. Now, you might be wondering right now, why are you checking for the user and the password all at once? Wouldn't you want to do them separately? And the answer to that used to be, yes, let's be as specific as possible. But in more recent years, there's this concept in security called security through obscurity, where you intentionally do not give someone too much information about what went wrong because you don't necessarily want them to know which part they got wrong. If they're trying to hack into somebody else's account, you don't want them to know, oh yeah, you got the username right. It's only the password that was wrong, or vice versa. So we're going to be a little more obscure and we're just going to give them a more generic message. I'm going to say credentials invalid. Please try again with correct username password combination. So I'm going to be a little vague on purpose. Okay. And then we can just return them back to the form. Okay. So those are all the cases in which we're going to, not let them proceed. But if everything's cool, if we have a user and we have a matching password, then it's going to skip this and we're going to come down here and say set user in session. And we can go and get the session from request, and then we can give them the user object that we already looked up and just say return, and we're going to redirect them to artworks, just like we did with registration. We want them to end up there either way. All right, and it'll send them, it'll go run that controller so that it can do everything it needs to do to load that page properly. All right, so that, ladies and gentlemen, was registration and login. The very last thing to do before we take a break is, we kind of don't have time for a break, so, but we might do it anyway. Okay, so just so your brains don't explode. To log out, you're going to want to have a link somewhere to log out. We're going to do that in a minute. And you want to have a get handler for this that basically just says, okay, let's access the request. And then we're going to just say request.get session. And then we're going to call this method called invalidate. And it just goes and it makes the session invalid. That session key no longer will work. And then you can just redirect them to wherever you want, login page, home page, wherever you want them to go. But it's going to be somewhere where, once you've set up some filtering, they're no longer going to have access to, something they might have had access to before. So let's do this real fast. Just a little get handler. Get mapping for logout. Probook string logout. request. Okay. We're gonna say request dot get session dot invalidate. And then return, redirect, login. I'm gonna send them back to login in this case if they log out. Because I really only have 2 pages that they would be able to access without being logged in for this. And register doesn't make sense because they clearly already are registered. So I'm going to send them to login. Okay, that's all that needs to be done for that. It's very straightforward. So the question is, we have all this in place now, but how do we control what they can see, right? And there's also some other things that we need to put into place for the authentication itself. I want to talk about all of that, but I want to do it in a minute. And I do want to give everybody a break. Here's the thing the executive decision I'm making. We're going to go late tonight, just a little bit. So you're going to go to studio a little late, but I'd rather us do that and me be able to explain it clearly, and also for us to be able to take a 5-minute break right now. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Yes. Yeah, that works.
That's
Okay.
good.
All right, so we'll take a break. If you've got burning questions, put them in the chat in the lecture questions channel, and I'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back. We'll get through this as quickly as I can. We're not quite done. We have to enable a couple more things and register all of this for the application for Spring to be able to, manage it. So one concept we need to talk about here is just filtering the requests. So we talked about how this whole thing is about creating a filter, right? So if you want to intercept those requests before the controller handlers execute, then you're going to create an authentication filter class at the very top level of the application. And I actually forgot to check if if the new curriculum has updated this or not, but originally it was saying to use the handler interceptor adapter class, but that's actually deprecated, and they're just asking people to implement handler interceptor now. So that may or may not be updated in the curriculum yet. So I'm going to do it that way. I'm going to just implement that interface for us to set this up. And we're going to auto wire an instance of the authentication controller to the filter. So ordinarily you're using auto wiring for, auto wiring the repositories to the controllers. We're going to auto wire the controller to the filter. And then we're going to have an override of the pre-handle method that checks the user status. And this will say, okay, as long as we use the same signature that pre-handle actually has, we can just include a response and a handler. Even though we aren't going to need everything, we just have to match it. So we're going to include those. And then we just create a session variable by calling get session on that request. And that will allow us to create the user. And as long as they're not null, it means that they're logged in. So then we can return true. And that is going to give us that, pre-handling to verify that we actually have a user in session before we move forward. If they're not logged in, we're going to redirect them to log in and return false. So that's where we're actually going to, allow that to move forward. So let's do this part where we actually go and create this authentication filter class. So we want to put this, I said we at the top level, and of course what I really mean by that is that it just needs to go in the same place where our art gallery application file is, which is, right here in art gallery. So I'm going to right click and say new class and call it authentication filter. Okay. And this is going to implement that interface I mentioned, implement handler interceptor. And we'll be able to take advantage of some of the functionality that's built into that. All right, so first we said we would auto wire our authentication controller. And just call it authentication controller. Okay, so we're going to whitelist some certain pages. We'll do that in just a second. But let's go ahead and come down here and write this pre-handle method that we just talked about. So I'm going to do @override. We said this is an existing method, has an existing signature. We just want to override it. So we'll do pre-handle, and it's going to have HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response, and then object handler. Okay. And we also need to allow it to throw this particular exception. So we're going to add that. And that is the signature that we need. Okay. I'm realizing now that there are enough things here that correspond to the idea of whitelisting. They probably should have gone over whitelisting before I started typing all of this. So I'm gonna pause on this and let's go talk about whitelisting, and then we'll finish the entire thing. So whitelisting is this idea that you say these are the pages that anyone can access. So right above the pre-handle, we're going to define a list of strings that correspond to those routes. And that's our whitelist. We're going to create an array. We're going to take an array and pass it to a list so that we can make it a list. And then, but you know, it's instantiate it easily, initialize it easily. And then we'll just give it each of those routes that we want to make publicly available. And if we have any kind of sub routes, we don't need to list them. They're going to be included. It's basically just going to be what the root route is. It'll allow that. So you can be as specific as you want to be. In this case, you know, we're really just going to, you know, register and login is what we're mostly concerned with. And then we're going to have a method that we define is whitelisted to check. And see if it's in the list, then we'll return true. If it's not, we'll return false. Then in that pre-handle method we were in the middle of writing, before we go get the session, we want to do an early return if that requested path is whitelisted, because we don't even need to continue doing that pre-handling if it's a public facing page anyway, right? That we are happy with them seeing regardless. We don't need to filter. So that will allow us to be very specific about what we're going to allow. So let's come back up here where I said I was going to, you know, create this whitelist, and let's do that. We're going to have a private static final. So this is a constant list of strings, and I failed to import list. There we go. We're going to call it whitelist. And again, I'm going to use arrays as list so that I can just type these in directly. And I'm going to say, I've got something called welcome. I actually changed my home controller. I can show it to you in a second, the gallery controller, so that it reroutes from the home localhost 8080 to /welcome. So we're going to allow that. And then we're also going to allow register /login. And then I also have some CSS and some images that I want to be able to be available. So I'm going to go ahead and whitelist those as well. Okay, that's my list. Then we can actually have that is whitelisted method and say private static Boolean is whitelisted. Ask the question, is it whitelisted or not? And we'll just pass in a path to check. So for the root of that path that is in the whitelist, and that's lowercase l, all one word, if the path equals just the home path, or if the path starts with path root, which is the individual one we're looking at one at a time as we're going through, then we'll return true. Otherwise, once it gets to the end, if it's checked them all, then we're just going to return false. Okay. Now, down in pre-handle, this is where we're going to make use of this. So we're going to say if we check the request and say, get that request URI, so it gets that root for us. If it is the home path, or if it starts with one of the things in that list, return true. We'll just return early, and then we don't even need to continue. But if it's not whitelisted, then we need to actually, take note of what the session is. So I'm going to say, we have an that's not what I want. Session, there we go. We have an HTTP session that is the request.get session that we need access to. We also need access to the user. So we're going to go to the controller that we auto-wired, get the user from the session using that session that we just looked up. And now we can check to see if they're logged in. If the user is not null, then we can return true. But if they're not logged in, then we need to do a response.send redirect and say we want to go to login. And then return false. So that send redirect is a method of this response object here, this HTTP servlet response, that allows us to redirect to another route so that it can go to the controller and use that handler instead. And then we return false. So this will take care of all of the pre-handling to have that filter in place so that we can check to see if they exist and they're logged in before we do anything. Then we have to register it. So at the very top level, again, the same place where we just put this filter, we're going to create another file called web application config. It's going to be a Java class, and it's going to implement the web MVC configurer interface. And then we'll add a configuration annotation so that it knows that it's a configuration class. That's important. We also want to add a method that is going to return an instance of that filter we just created. And it's going to have an annotation called bean. And then we're going to override the add interceptors method so that we can actually register that this interceptor that we created and get it and make sure Spring is aware of it so that it can use the filter. Otherwise, it's not going to use it. Okay. So we'll come over here and again, in Art Gallery, I'm going to right click, create a new class and call it Web Application Config. All right. It needs to be a, come on, configuration. And it needs to implement the web MVC configurer interface. Okay. So here's the object that we said we needed to make this a bean that is going to return, it's actually a method, authentication filter. There it is. Okay. We're going to have a method that's going to return an object of that. So return new authentication filter because we have to instantiate it. Okay. And then we'll have this override of the add interceptors method, which doesn't return anything. It just goes and registers the filter for us. Interceptor registry. So we're tapping into this registry and saying, go add an interceptor, and we want it to be the authentication filter and return that object and call this thing we just wrote. And then it will register it for us. Okay. All right. That is all well and good, but there is one more thing we need to do, two more things really. One is that, remember I said that in the controller, we were going to need to determine whether someone was logged in or not so that the page can use that. Because if we go to these things, you can see, no, not here. Sorry. There's one more thing we need to do. I knew there was one more thing. Give me a second. It's not here. It's in fragments. It's in fragments. Okay, so our nav menu needs to look different depending on whether someone's logged in or not, right? So I already have this coded because I knew I wouldn't have time. And so I'm just going to uncomment these. But you can see here that I've got a th unless and a th if. And I'm saying if the user is logged in here, then we want them to see artists and artworks and styles and log out. If they're not, then the only things we want them to see is log in and register. So we have this conditional display of these links. And it depends on this Boolean logged in being passed to the template. So that means that in our authentication controller here, we actually need to send that down. So I'm going to just add a little bit of logic here that is going to allow us to do that. So for example, we actually need to go to register. We're going to say model.add attribute and say logged in is going to depend on session get attribute user not being null. Okay. And actually, we probably should just say user session key there, but yeah, that would be better because it already exists. User is that string. Okay, so as long as that's not null, then we can tell that they're logged in. If it is, then it'll be false, and then or it'll be true, and then I'm saying this backwards, but you know what I'm getting at. They're either logged in or they're not. This will help the page know which of the links to display. So let's run this thing and see if everything is working the way we expect it to. So one thing we have yet to do is actually test all this code that we just added, right? Okay. So we can go to localhost 8080 and it's not there yet. Now it's there. Okay. There we go. Okay. So we see the page that you're accustomed to seeing, but look what we have. We have either login or register. Those are the only things we can see because there is no session. So I could go to the login page and try to, log in if I already existed, but I don't. So I'm going to use this link here and say register here, and we'll come in and I can put my name in and say, Carrie Jones, and I can put in, some sort of password. If I do it wrong, I can, try to register. It says passwords do not match. If I try to put in something that's too short, username must, oh, it says username. I didn't update that. I need to fix that. That should say password, right? We can fix that later. Anyway, but this is why you test everything, right? So let's say I do it right. And I register and I'm in, and look, now I have a different menu. I've got artist, artwork, styles, and then I have logout. And I can go, I'm free to move about the application now. I can come in here and I can look at all these different things that we've got from the database. And if we go over and we actually check the database, which I have here, but I need to move to your screen so that you can see it. I can update these tables now and see that I have a user table. And if I open it up, I can see that I have two users. I have Loki Laufeyson, because I was watching Loki last night, and I have Carrie Jones. So two working users in here, and either one of them will do. So I could log out, and I could come over here and say, I want to log in as Loki Laufeyson now, and I could do that. And I just have to remember what the password was. There we go, and I log in. But every time I do that, it invalidates the session, and I have to start over. But it's correctly handling all of that redirecting and routing. It's handling the thing. And if I go right now and I try, this is something else that's interesting to do. If you try to put in artworks, it just sends me back to login. If I try to put in artists, it sends me back to login. So even if I try manually to change those paths up there, even if I don't have the links visible to me, that's the other thing, is you have to make sure that they still can't get to it if they try to get to it some other way. Maybe the link is saved in the browser. And you experience this. If you've logged out of a website for a while, your session's going to get invalidated after, a week or 2 weeks or whatever. And you go back in, sometimes you might have a bookmark saved in your browser, and that was like where it was on your dashboard where you were logged in, but now it's making you log in and it reroutes you. That's exactly what you're doing here by having all that logic in place with that filter. Okay, we just did a lot, guys. Who has questions? I know we went a few minutes over time. No questions? Okay, well, you're gonna do something similar to this for a very bare bones tech jobs app tonight. And Thursday's our very last class. My last class with you anyway. We're gonna talk about REST, and I'm going to show you what it looks like to have a full stack application where you actually have a separate front end application that can reach out to your Java Spring application to get data, because you're going to make it into an API. Then you'll have your catch-up class on Monday. That's when all of your assignments are due, so that you can continue to Unit 3. Tonight for Studio, you've got a very pared down version of Tech Jobs Persistent, where you're going to add authentication. Just follow the instructions. You're going to do what they did for coding events. You're going to do what I just did. And you can also try using session is empty to conditionally display certain page links. That's another way of doing it. I did it slightly differently. And just make sure it's consistent with your whitelisting. And that'll give you some more practice with this. And then when you go to do your capstone project for Liftoff, you will already have a good handle on this, and you'll be able to implement authentication for your full stack application.